I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
the office of President of the United States.
And will
As 1977 began, it was James Earl Carter from Georgia who picked up the heaviest burden. As America's 39th president, he faced more challenges and carried more hopes than could rightly be expected of any one man. But he saw himself as a man with a mission, and he made certain that the world knew exactly what it was.
Our commitment to human rights must be absolute, but let no one confuse our idealism with weakness. Because we are free, we can never be indifferent to the fate of freedom elsewhere.
On the domestic front, the president's main concern was energy conservation, a need soon dramatized when Arctic winds from northern Canada gave many states their worst winter in federal history. The Mississippi froze, and even Niagara had more ice than running water. It may have looked pretty in parts, but it was no winter wonderland. In Buffalo, in upstate New York, snow fell for 6 weeks, causing 21 deaths. Nationwide, 100 people died, and some 3 million were put out of work. There simply wasn't enough energy to heat homes and keep the factories running. Several states declared emergencies, and the final cost was put at $3 billion. President Carter went on television to warn Americans that the battle for energy was the moral equivalent of war. His plan of campaign was drastic: halve oil imports and reduce domestic consumption by hefty taxes on thirsty automobiles. The package met opposition from industry and consumers, and its passage through Congress was painful. There was more drama in July when New York blacked out after power lines were hit by lightning. It was smaller than the '65 blackout, but more destructive. Last time, apparently, people stayed home and made babies. This time, they came out on the streets looking for trouble and finding it. Thousands of stores were looted and many were totally destroyed. The power company first called it an act of God, but later admitted a series of errors by men and machines. From blackout to blowout, Europe too had an energy disaster when a valve failed on this North Sea oil well. The oil was Norway's, but the producing company was American. They called in Red Adair's team, who said conditions on the rig were nastier and hotter than hell. It took the Texans 8 days to get the lid back on. Europe was the choice for President Carter's first trip abroad. In May, he came to England for a summit in London and a tour of the Northeast. This trip was a personal triumph, but his popularity at home dwindled, and by year's end, the president had to cancel a 9-nation tour to steer his energy plans through Congress. In Europe, 1977 was the year of the hijack. It began in May, when this school in northern Holland was taken over by South Moluccan nationalists. 100 children were taken hostage. At the same time, a nearby train was hijacked, together with 54 passengers. The South Moluccans demanded the release of colleagues imprisoned in a similar attack 2 years ago. Many of the school children were ill with suspected food poisoning, and the gunmen released them after 2 terrifying days. But for the train passengers, it was different. It was 3 weeks before Dutch jets streaked over in a deafening dawn attack. With the hijackers' attention diverted by the noise, ground troops moved in. Within 10 minutes, it was all over, but not without bloodshed. 6 hijackers and 2 hostages were killed, and 7 more hostages were injured. Most hijackings happened in the air. In October, Japan released 6 convicted terrorists as ransom for passengers hijacked over India by Japan's so-called Red Army guerrillas. The prisoners were only part of the ransom. The rest was $6 million, all in $100 bills. The Japanese had to fly bills in from America, but they paid. The hijacked plane eventually landed in Dakar, where the ransom was handed over. More than 100 hostages were released here, but a handful had to stay till journey's end in Algiers. Japan claimed the payment was the only way of saving the passengers' lives, but Premier Fukuda was widely criticized for giving in. Hans Martin Schleyer, a West German industrialist, was at the center of the year's most dramatic hijacking. He'd been brutally kidnapped in September by members of the Red Army faction in Germany. They issued this videotape to prove he lived, then demanded a ransom of $15 million and freedom for imprisoned colleagues. 5 weeks later, this German jet was taken from Europe to the Gulf by hijackers demanding freedom for the same prisoners, the remaining members of the Baader-Meinhof gang. Most of the negotiating was done in Dubai, but though food and other provisions were supplied, the West German government refused to meet any other demands. It all ended in Mogadishu, Somalia, where specially trained West German commandos stormed aboard the plane. 3 of the 4 hijackers were killed and 1 badly injured. The West German pilot had been killed by the hijackers in Aden, but for the remaining 86 hostages, it was a merciful end to a journey which should have taken 2 hours, but in fact lasted 5 days. For the commandos, it was the end of a mission even more successful than Israel's raid on Entebbe last year. For the world, it was one more demonstration that international terrorism could be defeated. There was a stunning postscript. In prison, 3 of the Baader gang heard the news and killed themselves in their cells. Demonstrations at the funeral showed the gang still had a following. The killing still wasn't over. The body of Hans Martin Schleyer was found the next day in a car in eastern France. He was given a state funeral in Stuttgart. In Spain, the main drama was on the political front. The Communist Party was made legal, and exiles such as Dolores Ibarruri, La Pasionaria, returned to give it new life. The country's first elections in 40 years were held in June. Leading the field was the centre-left coalition led by Premier Adolfo Suarez. He gained a massive majority, with the Socialists second and the Communists a poor third. After the battle for central power, the focus moved to the regions. Barcelona welcomed back Josep Tarradellas, exiled leader of the Catalan nation. Madrid revived Catalonia's regional autonomy and made Tarradellas first president. Similar measures were planned for the Basque provinces in 1978. In Northern Ireland, violence between Catholics and Protestants was down, with casualties more than halved, but British troops still found it tough. There were times when it was just as bad in England. In August, a clash between right and left wingers produced London's worst street violence since World War II. It was no way to celebrate Jubilee Year, but fortunately the Union Jack fared a great deal better among the rest of the nation. Queen Elizabeth had a busy year, both at home and abroad. Throughout it all, the Queen stayed alert and interested, which was more than could be said for Defence Minister Mully at the Jubilee flypast. The royal year ended with the Queen as a granny. In November, Princess Anne gave birth to a fine bouncing boy. There was another royal jubilee in Jordan. King Hussein took the cheers alone. His queen had been killed in a helicopter crash in February. A lot happened in the Middle East. In Israel, Premier Yitzhak Rabin resigned in April after revelations about his foreign bank accounts. His departure was a crushing blow for the ruling coalition. But in the elections that followed, it was still expected that his successor, Shimon Peres, would lead Labour to its usual victory. When the votes were counted, though, it was the opposition who did the dancing. It was a stunning political upset. The winning party, Likud, was a generally right-wing alliance headed by Menachem Begin, a committed Zionist who spoke not of occupied territory, but of liberated lands. Begin authorized new Israeli settlements on the West Bank, and it looked as if the whole Arab-Israeli conflict was heading for a hardening of attitudes. American Secretary of State Cyrus Vance made his second trip of the year, both to Arab capitals and to Israel, in an effort to restart the peace talks in Geneva. He criticized the settlements and passed on President Carter's support for a Palestinian homeland, but the Israelis appeared unmoved and unmovable. In Lebanon, meanwhile, everyone was doing their best to persuade themselves that life was returning to normal. Nightclubs reopened, and Beirut's beauties made a welcome reappearance. But it was different in the south. Down on the Israeli border, the civil war had never ended. Palestinians fought Christians who were aided by the Israelis. In November, the Palestinians sent rockets into Israel. In the town of Nahariya, 3 people were killed. Israel's vengeance came 2 days later. The port of Tyre was shelled by Israeli jets, and houses were flattened in nearby villages. 100 people are believed to have died. The Middle East was on the brink again, but hope was on its way from Egypt. Egypt's year had begun badly. In January, cuts in government subsidies sent food prices rocketing and led to serious rioting in Cairo and all major towns. There were more problems in July, when Egypt's strained relations with Libya erupted into 6 days of border warfare. Egyptian jets bombed Libyan air bases and radar installations, inflicting heavy casualties. President Sadat claimed he'd given the Libyans a lesson they'd never forget. 4 months later, Sadat the warrior turned into Sadat the man of peace. He achieved the impossible by visiting Israel, the first Arab head of state ever to do so. The visit was by far the boldest peace initiative in 3 decades of Arab-Israeli conflict. Sadat's reputation and even his life were put at risk. The Knesset, Israel's parliament, was still gasping in disbelief when the president arrived to deliver his speech.
Bismillah.
Many Arabs had feared a sellout, but Sadat's message was clear: no peace treaty without the Palestinians. There were no promises on either side, but when the 2-day visit was over, the road to Geneva looked clearer than before. In Black Africa, the year began on a festive note. Over 50 nations came to Nigeria in January for the second African Festival of Art and Culture. But there was little to dance about in Zaire, where the rule of President Mobutu Sese Seko was threatened by an invasion of exiles from the former province of Katanga. The president himself admitted that the first few hours of the invasion had inflicted a moral defeat on Zaire's armed forces. It took 1,500 Moroccan troops to chase the invaders back across the Angolan border. In the Horn of Africa, a new nation came into being. In June, the territory of Afas and Issas became the independent Republic of Djibouti. In neighboring Ethiopia, a new ruler emerged. By but Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu had to struggle to hold the country together despite Soviet military aid. In the north, the Eritrean liberation movements continued to gain ground, and by year's end, government control was limited to the capital and a handful of small towns and villages. In the east, there was an even more spectacular advance by Somali-backed rebels. Behind it all, a story of changing allegiances by the major powers. America switched from Ethiopia to Somalia, while the Russians went the other way around. In South Africa, the black townships were generally quieter, but there was more outspoken criticism, especially from the young, who played a bigger role in township politics. But the event which overshadowed all others was the death of black leader Steve Biko. He died in police custody in circumstances that made many suspect murder. Black anger over his death could scarcely be contained, and the government had to shut down black organizations and newspapers to stem the chorus of accusations. Police Minister Kruger claimed Biko had been on hunger strike and said police brutality could be ruled out. But there were many South Africans, black and white, who thought otherwise.
I want to be very careful that we accuse this government of the death of Biko.
As the year ended, the UN imposed an arms embargo, and Premier Forster called early elections to support his stand against foreign interference and one man, one vote. In Rhodesia, the guerrilla war continued. Government forces inflicted more casualties than ever before, but they lost more of their own men in doing so. Meanwhile, the violence spread to Salisbury itself. As conscription was extended to 50-year-olds, the number of whites leaving was reported to have doubled. Despite this, confidence in the government remained high. In the August elections, Ian Smith's party swept the board against a reorganized opposition. The victory certainly strengthened his hand in dealing with the peace proposals brought to Rhodesia by Britain's Foreign Secretary and America's UN ambassador. The Anglo-American plan called for majority rule in 1978, and not surprisingly, Mr. Smith couldn't agree. On another continent, two powerful women were voted out of office. In Sri Lanka, Mrs. Bandaranaike, history's first woman premier, was defeated by high unemployment and the voters' traditional swing away from the ruling party. In India, Mrs. Gandhi decided to seek popular approval for her regime after 2 years of emergency rule. In January, she declared an unshakable faith in the power of the people and placed her future in the ballot box. But it didn't work out as she'd planned, and in the elections 2 months later, she was defeated by the Janata Party, an opposition alliance led by 81-year-old Morarji Desai. He restored civil liberties and set up investigations into the former regime's use of power. As a result, Mrs. Gandhi herself spent a night in jail. She was released into crowds of supporters and had to literally fight her way out. In Pakistan, Prime Minister Bhutto also fell from power after going to the polls. The only difference was that he actually won the elections. The opposition claimed the voting had been rigged, and when Bhutto emerged victorious, they boycotted Parliament. Bhutto offered to hold new elections, but the rioting that had marred the campaign broke out worse than before. The riots lasted for weeks, and at least 350 were killed. In May, the army's General Zia seized power. He promised elections within 90 days, but later changed his mind. In Latin America, the Panama Canal was the subject of a controversial new treaty signed in September by President Carter and Panama's Brigadier General Torrijos. It would give Panama control by the end of the century, but there were people on both sides who felt it shouldn't become law. There were changes at the top in the Soviet Union. Chief victim was President Nikolai Podgorny, who lost his sense of direction on an African tour and later lost his job. In October, Moscow celebrated the 60th anniversary of the revolution with a bigger than usual display of military strength. Watching from Lenin's tomb was Leonid Brezhnev, now Soviet president as well as party secretary. Among the hardware, the impressive new T-72 tank. Defense Minister Ustinov claimed Soviet might was now unassailable. The world's worst air crash came in March. 2 jumbo jets collided on takeoff at Tenerife Airport and 582 people died. There were 62 survivors, many badly injured. Incredibly, 15 escaped unhurt. The same month saw a disaster in Romania. A massive earthquake struck just north of Bucharest. The effects were felt as far as thousands of homes were destroyed, and rescuers had to work day and night in the capital. 1,500 were killed, over 11,000 were injured. Among the year's other deaths, Archbishop Makarios of Cyprus. He was 63. It was a bad year for singing superstars. Egypt's Abdel Halim Hafez died in April. He was little known outside the Arab world, but in Cairo he was king. Elvis Presley's fans actually called him the king. In 20 years in show business, he sold 500 million records. But it came to an end in August. Fans came from all over America to mourn at his Memphis home. Maria Callas, controversial genius of opera, died in September. Groucho Marx immortalized a night at the opera in a different way, and millions loved him for it. In October, Harry Lillis died playing his favorite game. He was better known as Bing Crosby. Burt Lance didn't die, but his career as America's budget manager collapsed after a Senate committee investigated the facts about his own banking habits. Lance denied any impropriety. President Carter called him a man of complete integrity, but in September he accepted his resignation. In New York, a new career started for Ed Koch. He came from nowhere to win the race for mayor. George Willig reached the top in his own way, locked into grooves in New York's tallest building. Englishman Tim Severin believed America was discovered by an Irish monk and sailed the Atlantic in a leather boat to prove it. But for many people, the year's most exciting exploit was America's space shuttle. The reusable spaceship will start its first mission in 1980, turning science fiction into science fact. In the animal world, there were several colourful stories, or rather colourless. This should have been a Scottish red deer. Even rarer, South African white lions. A zoo in Argentina had albino lions, similar in appearance but not to the scientist. There was tragedy too. Victor, the giraffe in an English zoo, did the splits one night whilst courting his mate and paid for it with his life. But the animal story of the year came undoubtedly from Mexico, where the world's first bionic bull made its appearance. All the speed and swerve of the real thing. Could this be the end of blood sports?